You just bought an NBA team. The deal is done. $8 billion gone. And in exchange, you now own a team that can generate hundreds of millions of dollars every year. Millions of people watch it. Companies pay to put their names on it. Fans buy tickets, jerseys, food, and everything else that comes with game night. And every season, the entire business gets another chance to become bigger. Sounds like a pretty good investment. Until you look at the price. $8 billion is a lot of money for a business that might only generate around $100 million in operating profit. At that rate, you'd need decades of profits just to get your money back. So why would anyone pay this much? Because you didn't just buy a basketball team, you bought something much harder to get. A seat in the NBA. There are only 30 of them, and you can't just decide to create number 31. The league decides who gets in, which means when someone wants to join, they don't build a competing NBA, they have to buy their way into the club. And that changes what your team is worth, because you're not simply selling basketball, you're owning one of the few businesses in the world where the supply is deliberately limited. But there's still a problem. Scarcity alone doesn't explain $8 billion. So where does all that money actually come from? You might think it's the tickets. And yes, you can charge hundreds of dollars just to watch a game from a good seat, but even a packed arena only holds so many people, and your team only plays so many home games. Tickets are valuable, but they're not the real engine. The real money comes from something you can't put in a seat. Attention. Every game gives the NBA something broadcasters desperately want. Millions of people watching the same thing at the same time. And that's incredibly valuable, because companies don't just want to advertise to people, they want to advertise to people who are already watching. So broadcasters pay the NBA enormous amounts of money for the right to show those games, and your team gets a piece of that ecosystem. The latest national media agreements are worth more than $76 billion over 11 years. That's roughly $7 billion every year. And now your $8 billion purchase starts looking a little less crazy. You're not just selling tickets, you're sitting on top of a machine that sells billions of dollars of attention. But there's a catch. You don't get to take your share of that money, put it straight into your bank account, and call it a day, because the NBA has another group waiting for its share, your players, and they're not taking a small one. Under the league's economic system, players receive roughly half of basketball-related income. So when the NBA makes more money, the players make more money too. And that means something strange happens to your business. The league gets richer, your revenue grows, but one of your biggest expenses grows with it. And now, we need to find out how much money you actually have left to pay for the product, because an NBA team isn't a software company. You can't make the game once and sell it a million times. You need players, and not just any players. You need enough talent on your roster to convince people to keep watching, and that gets expensive. Very expensive. For the 2026 to 27 season, the NBA's salary cap is almost $165 million per team, and that's just the starting point. Teams can spend above the cap under certain rules, but once you push far enough, the penalties become increasingly painful. There is a tax level, then a first apron, then a second apron, and the more you spend, the fewer tools you have to build your roster. So as the owner, you can't simply say, fine, I'll spend $500 million and buy the best team in the league. The league doesn't work that way, because the NBA has a problem to solve. The richest owners could spend without limits, the richest teams could simply buy the best players, win more, attract more fans, make more money, and then buy even more players. Eventually, you wouldn't really have a league. You'd have a handful of super teams, and everyone else would be playing for second place. So the NBA puts limits around how much you can spend. And there's another layer. The players don't just get whatever is left over after you've paid the bills. Their compensation is tied to the economics of the league itself. As the NBA makes more money, the players' share grows too, which means the machine we just discovered, the one generating billions from television, sponsorships, and fans, isn't simply making you richer. It's making the people who create the product more expensive. And suddenly, that $8 billion purchase looks very different, because revenue is one thing, profit is another. You could have hundreds of millions of dollars flowing through your team, and still end a season with far less than you expected. So let's stop looking at the NBA from the outside. Let's look at one season from your seat. So, the season is over. You sit down in your office, and for the first time, you get to see what your $8 billion purchase actually did. Let's start with the money coming in. Your team makes money every time someone walks through your arena. Tickets, suites, food, merchandise, sponsors, local media. And then there's the money you receive simply because you're part of the NBA. National television, streaming, league-wide sponsorships, revenue sharing, all of it gets added together. For a team operating at a healthy level, you could be looking at roughly $500 million in annual revenue. $500 million. That sounds incredible until you start subtracting. Your players need to be paid, your coaches need to be paid, your front office needs to be paid, you have trainers, scouts, travel, insurance, marketing, arena operations, and depending on how the arena was financed, you may have hundreds of millions of dollars tied up in the building itself. So let's say your team brings in around $500 million. It sounds like you're swimming in cash, but now imagine watching that $500 million disappear. $200 million here, $50 million there, another $100 million, then another $50 million, until suddenly that mountain of revenue has become a much smaller pile. And this is the part fans rarely see. A team can generate hundreds of millions of dollars, fill its arena, sell millions of dollars in merchandise, merchandise and still produce a surprisingly modest operating profit, because you're not running a business where the goal is simply to collect as much money as possible. You're running a business where you have to keep the entire product alive. The players need to want to stay. The fans need a reason to come back. The broadcasters need games worth showing. The sponsors need attention. And the league needs every team to remain competitive enough that people keep watching. So your job isn't simply, how do I make the most money this season? It's, how do I keep this entire machine valuable for the next 20 years? And that's where owning an NBA team gets really interesting, because the money you're making today may not be the most important money you're making. The real question is, what happens to the value of your team itself? So let's say your team makes $500 million a year. That's an incredible business, until you remember what you paid for it, $8 billion. If you were buying a normal company, you'd want the numbers to make sense. You'd look at the profit. You'd ask how long it would take to get your money back. You'd calculate the return you're getting on your investment. So let's do that. Suppose your team produces around $100 million in operating profit. You paid $8 billion. That's a return of only about 1.25% a year, before taxes, before financing, before major capital spending, and before anything goes wrong. At that rate, you'd need roughly 80 years of today's operating profit just to equal what you paid. And that's assuming the profit never changes. So if you're sitting in your new owner's office looking at these numbers, there's only one reasonable conclusion. You overpaid, or we're looking at the business the wrong way, because nobody buying an NBA team for billions is doing it because they expect to slowly collect $100 million a year forever. They're buying something else, something that doesn't appear on the income statement, the team itself. And this is where owning an NBA team starts to look very different from owning an ordinary business. Because if your team becomes more valuable, you don't need the annual profit to justify the entire investment. You can make money simply because the asset you own is now worth more than when you bought it. And NBA teams have already shown just how quickly that can happen. The average NBA franchise is now worth around $5.4 billion. Just a few years ago, that number was roughly half as large. So maybe the real business isn't the $100 million you make this year. Maybe it's what your $8 billion asset becomes 10 years from now. And that changes the question completely, because now we need to understand why an NBA team can become worth so much more over time. The answer starts with something that has nothing to do with this season's profit. You bought scarcity. There are only 30 NBA teams, and you can't simply build another one. If you have $8 billion sitting in your bank account, you can't walk into a city and announce that you're starting the 31st NBA team tomorrow. The league decides who gets in, and that makes your team fundamentally different from most businesses. If you own a restaurant, someone can open another restaurant across the street. If you own a clothing company, someone can launch a competing brand. But if someone wants another NBA team, they need the NBA to let them in. And that limited supply matters, because the number of people who want to watch basketball can grow. The amount advertisers are willing to spend can grow. The amount broadcasters are willing to pay can grow. But the number of teams doesn't automatically grow with it. So the same 30 seats can become more valuable as more money flows through the league. And you're not just buying the right to operate a basketball team, you're buying access to everything attached to that seat. The national media deals, league-wide sponsorships, merchandising, the global NBA brand, the fans, the arena business, and the future revenue that comes with all of it. That's why an NBA team can be worth billions. Even when its current profit doesn't come close to justifying the price, you're buying the right to participate in the future of the league. And there's a simple way to see just how valuable that right might be. Look at what the next owner has to pay for it, because the next owner doesn't get to buy your team. They have to get their own. And right now, the NBA is exploring exactly that. The league is looking at expansion into markets like Las Vegas and Seattle, and the numbers being discussed are enormous, potentially $7 to $10 billion just for the right to join the league. Nothing is official yet, but think about what that means for you. You paid $8 billion for your team, then another owner comes along and potentially pays roughly the same amount without buying your team. They're paying just to get a seat at the table, and you don't get their money, but you do get something else, a new benchmark, because suddenly the market has another transaction telling everyone what an NBA franchise is worth. And if someone is willing to pay $8 billion to get in, your $8 billion team doesn't look quite so crazy anymore. In fact, it could become worth even more. That's the strange part about owning a scarce asset. You don't need someone to buy your team for the market to tell you that your team is worth more. Someone else's purchase can do it for you. And if the NBA keeps growing, that effect can compound. More media money, more sponsors, more fans, more streaming, and potentially more valuable teams. But there's a problem with this entire argument. We're assuming the NBA keeps getting bigger. We're assuming those billions in media money keep flowing. We're assuming fans keep showing up. And we're assuming your team can actually turn that growth into a valuable business. Because now that you've seen what your seat in the NBA is worth, we need to talk about what it actually takes to keep that seat valuable. But keeping that seat valuable isn't free. Because once you're an NBA owner, you can't just sit back and watch the franchise become more valuable. You have to keep giving people a reason to care about it. That starts with the team itself. You need players. You need coaches. You need a front office that can actually build a competitive roster. And if your team team starts losing, the problem isn't just what's happening on the court. Fans can stop showing up, sponsors can become harder to attract, TV audiences can fall, and suddenly the hundreds of millions of dollars you were counting on start looking a lot less certain. That's why owners are constantly balancing two completely different goals: win and make money. Because spending more on players can give you a better chance of winning, but spending too much can destroy your margins. And the NBA has made that decision even more complicated. The salary cap is now almost $165 million. And once your payroll moves beyond certain thresholds, the financial penalties become increasingly severe. So you can't simply buy your way to a championship. You have to decide where every extra dollar is worth spending. And there's another problem. Some of the biggest pieces of your business aren't entirely under your control. The NBA negotiates the national media deals. The league controls expansion. The players' union influences the rules around compensation. And your local market determines how much fans and sponsors are willing to spend. You might run your team perfectly and still be affected by decisions being made hundreds of miles away. That's the uncomfortable part of ownership. You're paying $8 billion for an asset, but you don't control everything that determines its value. Still, if you can keep the team competitive, keep the fans engaged, and keep the business growing, that $8 billion asset could become worth significantly more. So let's stop talking about what could happen. Let's put the purchase on paper and see what this investment actually looks like. So let's put the purchase on paper. You paid $8 billion for the team, and let's use a reasonable operating scenario. Your team generates around $500 million in annual revenue after player salaries, staff, arena operations, marketing, travel, and everything else. Let's say you're left with around $100 million in operating profit. That's your business today. And as an owner, that means your operating return on the $8 billion you paid is only about 1.25%. Not exactly impressive, but remember, you didn't buy this team expecting it to stay an $8 billion asset forever. You bought it because you believe it can become worth more. So let's see what that would actually mean. If your team became 3% more valuable every year, your $8 billion franchise would be worth roughly $10.8 billion after 10 years. At 6%, it would be worth around $14.3 billion. And at 9%, you're looking at almost $19 billion. Now suddenly, the $100 million annual operating profit isn't the whole story, because even a few percentage points of growth in the value of the franchise can represent hundreds of millions of dollars. That's the reason someone can accept a relatively low operating return on an NBA team. They're not only looking at what the business earns today, they're looking at what someone else might be willing to pay for the asset tomorrow. But there's a catch. Those numbers assume the team keeps becoming more valuable, and that's not guaranteed. If the value barely moves, your 1.25% operating return starts looking terrible again. And if the value actually falls, you could be sitting on an $8 billion asset that isn't worth $8 billion anymore. So the entire investment comes down to one question: can the NBA keep growing fast enough to justify what you're paying for it today? That's the bet. And so far, it looks pretty good. The league has a massive audience. Media companies just committed tens of billions of dollars to broadcast its games. New markets are being explored, and the number of people willing to pay for an NBA franchise keeps getting larger. But there's a problem. None of that is guaranteed, because when you pay $8 billion, you're not just buying what the NBA is worth today, you're paying for a future where it's worth considerably more. And that future has to cooperate. Imagine the next media deal doesn't grow as quickly. Your biggest source of league-wide revenue slows down. At the same time, player salaries keep rising, arena costs rise, insurance rises. Everything around the team becomes more expensive. Your revenue is still growing, but your costs are growing almost as fast. And suddenly, that $100 million operating profit gets squeezed. Maybe it becomes $70 million, maybe $30 million. Maybe one bad season pushes it close to zero, and that's before the biggest risk of all. You don't control the sport. You don't control the next media deal. You don't control what the players negotiate. You don't control whether the league expands. You don't control whether fans keep watching at the same rate. You own the team, but the value of that team depends on an entire ecosystem you share with 29 other owners. And if that ecosystem keeps growing, your $8 billion asset could become worth far more. But if growth slows, the math changes very quickly. Because remember what we calculated: at $8 billion, a $100 million operating profit gives you only about a 1.25% operating return. That means you need the value of the franchise itself to do a lot of the heavy lifting. And that's the real risk. You're not making an $8 billion bet on one basketball team. You're making an $8 billion bet on the future of the NBA. So now we can finally answer the question we've been building toward. After everything we've seen, would you actually buy it for $8 billion? If you were buying the team purely for the money it generates today, probably not. Around $500 million in revenue, around $100 million in operating profit, a roughly 1.25% operating return on an $8 billion purchase. Those numbers alone don't make the deal particularly attractive, but that's not really what you're buying. You're buying one of only 30 seats in the NBA. You're buying into a league with billions of dollars in media revenue, a global audience, major sponsors, and a business where the supply of franchises is deliberately limited. And if the NBA continues to grow, the value of that seat can grow with it. That's why someone could look at an an $8 billion price tag, see a relatively small annual operating return, and still decide the purchase makes sense because they're not asking, how much money will this team make me this year? They're asking, what will this team be worth when I eventually sell it? And that's the real game. But there's an important distinction. None of this means an NBA team is automatically a great investment. If you pay too much, growth slows, or the economics of the league change, you can lose a tremendous amount of money. The scarcity doesn't protect you from overpaying, the brand doesn't protect you from bad management, and a $1 billion valuation doesn't guarantee a $1 billion return. So, would I buy an NBA team for $8 billion if I believed the league could keep expanding its audience, keep growing its media business, and make these 30 seats increasingly valuable? Yes. Not because the team makes an incredible amount of money every year, but because I would be buying an asset that could be worth dramatically more in the future. And that's the strange thing about professional sports. You can spend billions on a business that doesn't generate billions in profit because you're not really buying the profits. You're buying the seat. And there are only 30 of them. So the question is, do you believe the next owner will be willing to pay more than you did? Because if the answer is yes, you may have just bought one of the most valuable seats in the world. If the answer is no, you just spent $8 billion on a basketball team.